Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Poole, and my guest is Scott Ritter, and we're going to talk about something that happened this week in the news that I think is really important: the inclusion of Sweden into NATO. So, Scott, when you heard that, what was your opinion?
Well, I mean, I was shocked because in the lead up to it, it appeared that everything was mitigating against Sweden being brought into NATO anytime soon. We had the long-standing Turkish disagreement with the Swedish government over Sweden's continued support for Kurdish separatists that the Turkish government views as terrorists. And Turkey had set forth a number of demands that involved Sweden making some domestic legal and political changes that many people, including myself, believed were just too big of an ask. But Sweden apparently has changed its laws, rewritten its laws, and has acceded to many, not all, but many of the Turkish demands. And so based on that, it appeared that that Erdogan was moving in a direction of sending the ratification package to the Turkish parliament. But then an Iraqi citizen of Sweden, an Iraqi-born citizen of Sweden, burned a Quran, and Swedish government did nothing to stop this event, and this inflamed, Turkish sentiment against Sweden, and it appeared that Sweden, that Erdogan wasn't going to be able to send the ratification paperwork in. And then Erdogan doubled down on this by making an announcement that Sweden would join NATO when the European Union invited Turkey. And Turkey has a multi-decades-long effort to join the European Union, and it's been frustrated in this at every turn. It's clear that the European Union doesn't want Turkey as a member. And so this appeared to be the final nail in the coffin of Sweden's membership bid. But less than 24 hours later, the Secretary General of the United Nations declares that Turkey is going to submit the Swedish package to that Erdogan will submit the package to the parliament for ratification. That Erdogan announced that he would be supporting this, and that he would put pressure on the parliament to ratify this. So that appeared to be the case. What caused Erdogan's flip-flop, so to speak? Seymour Hersh has written an interesting piece on his Substack where he has stated that that this involved the United States basically making available an 11 to 13 billion dollar injection of funding into the Turkish economy at a time when Erdogan desperately needs this kind of investment. Erdogan made the announcement that Sweden and other European countries were promising to invest in the Turkish economy. This would also help stabilize the lira, bring down inflation, and generally contribute to the overall health of the Turkish economy. This injection of 11 to 13 billion dollars the IMF also would result in that. It also appears that the United States has agreed to sell Turkey advanced F-16 fighters. This is something that Turkey has been asking for ever since the cooperation with the United States over the F-35 joint production collapsed. Turkey has been looking for a replacement for its aging fleet of aircraft, and the F-16 is something that Turkey has been saying they need. And indeed, if Turkey wants to continue to be part of the NATO nuclear sharing program, the United States currently has around 100 B-61 thermonuclear devices stationed, or not 100, maybe 60 stationed on Turkish soil. These bombs would be released to the Turkish Air Force in times of war and mounted on Turkish aircraft that are configured to deliver nuclear weapons. But these aircraft, the current fleet, which are F-16 fighters, are aging out. They're no longer operationally viable. And so the idea is that Turkey would have replaced them with the F-35A fighter, which is certified as a nuclear capable fighter, but that has fallen through. So Turkey has said, give us the F-16s or we will turn to Russia, who will sell us modern Su-34 and Su-35 fighters. This would also mean that Turkey would no longer be able to deliver nuclear weapons, which puts the U.S. nuclear stockpile on Turkish soil in question and could lead to the withdrawal of these nuclear weapons from Turkish soil, which would represent a retrograde in the nuclear sharing program that the U.S. doesn't want, because that could trigger a cascade of similar demands from nations like Germany. It's long been uneasy with the presence of 20 thermonuclear weapons on its soil. So by providing these F-16s to Turkey, the United States not only won over Turkey in the short term in terms of Swedish membership, but also made the nuclear sharing agreement viable by keeping Turkey as a participant.
What is the status right now of Ukraine being going into NATO?
Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, ever.
Why?
Doesn't qualify.
For what reason?
Corruption, basic lack of democracy, a lack of democratic institutions. There's a whole host of reasons. NATO has standards, and Turkey, Erdogan doesn't meet those standards. And that was made clear that even if the conflict ends, Ukraine would not be invited until which time it met all of the requirements. And that's virtually impossible task for Ukraine to do. But the biggest reason why Ukraine won't be a member is that it's losing a war against Russia. That once that's done, this current government won't be in a position to have any influence because it'll have been removed. And the next government of Ukraine will be a pro-Russian government, and they will not be looking for NATO membership.
So is on its border, on the Russian border, is NATO go along the entire border?
No, sorry about the dogs. They
That's
have a
okay.
mind of their own, and this is the time of day. I guess people are walking their dogs past our house. Dogs take umbrage at the competition. But the first of all, Sweden does not share a border with Russia, so its Swedish membership only adds to the military potential of NATO. It doesn't add to Russia's territorial problems. The biggest issue is Finland. Finland adds about 1,000 miles of border with Russia. And as Russia has said, previously it didn't view this border as problematic. They didn't view it as a threat, but now they will, and they will act accordingly. Whatever military capabilities Sweden or Finland develops, either unilaterally or jointly with other NATO nations, Russia will be compelled to respond to. And when Russia responds, it doesn't respond in a way that matches the capability. It responds in a way that will allow Russia to defeat the capability. So Finland will never be in a position where it's no longer inferior to Russia. Russia will always have superior military capacity over Finland. An interesting thing came out in the press conference that took place after the Vilnius summit when President Biden went to Finland to participate in the Nordic summit. A Finnish reporter asked the question, what happens if in the next election a new president is elected who doesn't view continued NATO membership as a good thing for the United States and seeks to withdraw the United States from NATO? What happens to Finland now that Finland has joined NATO on the premise that NATO is going to be around for a long time? Finland has radically altered its relationship with Russia. And now if say that a Donald Trump or a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gets elected and our stance on NATO dramatically alters, where does that leave Finland? And, Joe Biden, of course, could only answer it with just ridiculous platitudes about a rock solid commitment. America will never abandon. But that's not true. Donald Trump would pull America out of NATO in a heartbeat. And RFK Jr. is at least willing to to look at the viability of NATO, that he's not married to the notion of an expansive, aggressive NATO. And if America lessens its posture with NATO, withdraws from NATO, I don't view them withdrawing, but weakens its posture, where does that leave Finland? And where does that leave Sweden? And the answer is out in the cold. They've made a horrible mistake joining this failing alliance. They've lost their neutrality that allowed them to prosper and thrive. And all they've done is make their situation even more precarious, because whereas prior to their joining NATO, Russia posed no threat to them whatsoever, now Russia is rebuilding and reconfiguring its military to be able to defeat both Sweden and Finland in a general war with NATO. People should remember that Vladimir Putin expanded the size of the Russian military from 900,000 to 1.5 million, in a large part because of the threat posed by Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And Russia has created a new military district in the vicinity of Leningrad. 70,000 strong Army Corps will be stationed there. This is a corps that's singularly focused on fighting Sweden during war. Russia's nuclear component will now be reconfigured so that Swedish targets are incorporated into their target package, Finnish targets. This is a disaster for Finland and Sweden. It's something that I think in the coming years and decades, the citizens of both countries will regret the decision to join NATO, because it will only weaken them economically, militarily, and politically. It won't strengthen them.
Now you mentioned Trump and you mentioned RFK. Trump had 4 years to do it, to withdraw from NATO or disband NATO, or however you want to phrase it. He didn't do it. So why not?
Well, Trump had a lot of things he wanted to do that he didn't do. And I mean, the main reason is he was betrayed by those who he appointed in his cabinet. John Bolton, he was betrayed by Mike Pompeo. He was betrayed by a whole host of people who went behind his back, who argued against his policy direction. I can't speak to what a future Trump cabinet would look like, but I could imagine that it will not contain people who cut from the neoconservative cloth. If Trump wins this election coming, it's going to be because his base has enabled this, and so he will have no compunction to service traditional Republican, national security entities that are contained in the so-called deep state. And I think that Trump will be able to initiate the process. So what will be interesting is who Trump picks as his running mate. Some people talk about RFK Jr. being the Trump running mate. I don't know if that's possible, but let's just say that it was. Now you're looking at 12 years. Not 4 years. You're looking at 4 years of Trump and a potential of 8 years of an RFK Jr. presidency, 12 years. And a lot can happen in 12 years. Some meaningful changes can occur in 12 years. And I believe that if Trump were elected and he had RFK Jr. as his vice president, and at the end of the 12 years, NATO would either not exist or certainly wouldn't look like it currently looks. It would be a completely different organization.
You think that Kennedy would be comfortable being second banana?
Well, remember, you say second banana for 4 years.
Hmm.
And then he's first banana.
Hopefully, if the establishment doesn't get to them first, right?
If he's second banana, he is the establishment.
Oh, okay. So I remember 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was one little country. It was Cuba that had missiles targeted at the United States. One country, a small country. And now I look at NATO all across the border of Russia. We're in a much more precarious position now for a thermonuclear war than we were then, correct?
First of all, the size of our respective arsenals was extraordinarily small back then compared to what it is today, and the capabilities, you know, the ranges, the accuracy, the size of the warheads, all have progressed to the point that you can't even compare what would have happened in a nuclear conflict in 1962 with what would happen in a nuclear conflict today. But no, you're right. The other thing you have to remember about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that it was very much a controlled event. It wasn't just about Russian missiles in Cuba or Soviet missiles in Cuba. It was about American missiles in Turkey and Italy, especially in Turkey, where we had the Jupiter missile stationed. You know, the Jupiter missile could strike the Russian or the Soviet dacha that was used, frequented by Khrushchev in Pitsunda, which is a town off the coast of Soviet Georgia at the time. You know, it could strike that within minutes of being launched. And Khrushchev was often in Pitsunda. And from a Soviet perspective, every time he went to Pitsunda, the Soviet Union was 12 minutes away from decapitation, because if the missiles were launched, of course, Khrushchev wouldn't be able to evacuate. He'd be dead. And this was just an unacceptable situation for the Soviet Union. They wanted those missiles gone. So they created the Cuban Missile Crisis as a vehicle for creating the conditions for the withdrawal of U.S. missiles. The U.S. History has de-emphasized that because we don't want to admit that this wasn't the moment of overwhelming American strength forcing the Soviets to back down. We don't want to admit that the Soviets created a situation designed to have the Turkish missiles removed, and that the Soviets won. They succeeded in withdrawing the Jupiter missiles, and in exchange, they withdrew their missiles from Cuba. Today, we don't have this kind of situation. We just have the United States seeking pure unilateral advantages, and the Russians, without any effort to coordinate. Because remember, Cuban Missile Crisis was a controlled event where both the United States and the Soviet Union were working together to achieve a result that was acceptable to both parties. You have the United States today looking for unilateral advantages, and Russia countering that by creating their own unilateral advantages. There is no dialogue, there is no discussion, there is no framework. We are looking at the potential for an outbreak of an arms race that can only end in global annihilation. So yeah, this is a very, very dangerous situation right now, made even more dangerous by this recent NATO summit. I would advise people to go read the NATO communique and focus on what was said in paragraphs 44 and 45 that deal with the nuclear sharing arrangement, and the fact that NATO is now going to expand the number of nations that can deliver nuclear weapons. They are basically talking about the integration of delivery capability from the nations that are outside of the sharing arrangement, so that, for instance, a Polish Air Force plane can deliver a nuclear bomb that's currently based in Germany. Same for Finland, for Sweden, for any nation that has aircraft that are capable or configured to deal with nuclear weapons. And many NATO members are buying the F-35A. This is a horribly dangerous situation because it means that every time an F-35A takes off from a NATO base, Russia has to assume that it's carrying a nuclear weapon. And when you build in that kind of assumptions, that means that Russia's posture, defense posture, has to be geared towards responding to a kind of nuclear threat. So their own alert status will be heightened. And now we have a situation where one mistake, one miscalculation would lead to an event that causes the use of a nuclear weapon. And once one nuclear weapon's used, another will be used, and they have a cascading failure of the system, and everybody dies. So this is another reason why. I mean, I know there's people out there rolling their eyes when they say, Scott, why do you want NATO to go? You're betraying your country. NATO is a suicide pill. And a continued embrace of NATO, an organization that has no legitimate reason to continue to exist, that possesses a nuclear sharing arrangement that is in violation of the goals and objectives, and indeed the letter of the law set forth by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know, NATO is an organization that their only viability militarily is this nuclear arsenal, which means that any military conflict, dogs, lots of dogs, any military conflict that breaks out will inevitably lead to the conventional defeat of NATO. Means NATO will end up having to use nuclear weapons. As I said, a suicide pill.
So the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s, correct?
Soviet Union fell apart in December, dissolved in December 25th of 1991. That's when Gorbachev resigned.
Okay, so at that point, the ideology argument correct me if I'm wrong, no longer existed. In other words, we weren't fighting communism at that point, correct?
Oh, we stopped fighting communism a long time prior to that. There was broad recognition that when Mikhail Gorbachev assumed the role of General Secretary in 1985, that he was going to be leading the Soviet Union out of the stagnation of the communist period. Margaret Thatcher recognized this. She advised Ronald Reagan to treat Gorbachev differently than other Soviet leaders. And Gorbachev himself started a revolution. I think one of the most historical events of modern times, it's largely ignored here in the West, is the 19th All-Party Union Conference that Gorbachev convened in June of 1988. This was a revolutionary moment because it's when Gorbachev made the decision to dump the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, where he made the decision to transition away from single party rule into a democratic society, where he began the process that led to elections in March of 1989 for a people's deputies, a Congress of People's Deputies elected by the people, not appointed by the party. People who could be members of this didn't have to be members of the Communist Party. They could be anybody that the people would elect. And then they would elect a Supreme Soviet, sort of a Senate, who would then elect or select a president who would rule. A president, not the general secretary, but a president. This is a revolution that Gorbachev did. And in doing so, he announced the end of the dominance of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So any observer of Russia, any student of Russia at that time understood that, you know, the basis of Cold War confrontation being a clash of ideologies was over, that the Soviet Union no longer represented an ideological threat to the collective West. Indeed, had the West embraced Gorbachev, embraced perestroika, which is the process of restructuring that was ongoing, and invested in the Soviet economy in a way that enabled Gorbachev to transition from central planning dogma into more of a free market enterprise, but do it in a controlled fashion so that there wouldn't be wild fluctuations in the economic health, that industries would remain stable, that employment would remain stable, incomes remain stable as they go through the difficult process of transitioning. Had we done that, the Soviet Union wouldn't have collapsed. Moreover, it would have emerged as a very stable democracy. We would have built, Gorbachev together with the West would have been able to build democratic institutions from a foundation of strength. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Gorbachev went away, Boris Yeltsin became the head of the Russian Federation. But by that time, they had lost control of the situation. Russia spun out of control. It never became the democracy that it wanted to be. I mean, one only had to look at October 1993 when Yeltsin put tanks in the streets of Moscow, the fire on the Russian parliament, on the Russian Duma, tanks fired on the Russian Duma, killing members of parliament, setting the building ablaze. That is not democracy. That is dictatorship. And that's the reality. One only has to take a look at how Russia, the Russian economy collapsed, and what replaced it was corruption and the oligarchs and the massive theft of state, state property, and all of this. All of this could have been avoided had Gorbachev been supported by the West, but we didn't want that. We wanted the destruction of Russia. So the conflict, the ideological conflict, ended for a decade. But in 1999, the corrupt figure of Boris Yeltsin, knowing that he was on his last legs and fearing what would come after him, appointed Vladimir Putin as his successor. And since that time, a new ideology has emerged that the United States is afraid of. And that is the ideology of Russia as a sovereign state. You see, we can't tolerate Russia as a sovereign state. We need Russia to be broken up. We need Russia to be weakened. We need Russia. And this is the whole purpose of the expansion of NATO. The reason why we bring Sweden and Finland in isn't because we're strengthening them, is we're trying to create pressure on Russia to encourage the collapse of Russia. Vladimir Putin, most Americans have no clue who he is. Most Americans don't know anything about him except what they've heard on TV. And right off the bat, when you have, and again, I point an accusatory finger at everybody, including RFK Jr., who calls Putin a thug. Well, with all due respect, RFK, and I'm a big fan of RFK, Putin's not a thug. And you would know that if you studied Putin. Take the time to study Putin. Take the time to understand who he is and what he is, what he has accomplished, taking his nation out of the swamp and the chaos of the 1990s engendered by Boris Yeltsin and the exploitation of Russia by the collective West. And he's rebuilt Russia to what it is today, not a nation seeking violent expansion, but a nation seeking stability. They were compelled to go into Ukraine, and RFK Jr. knows this because he's articulated it by a combination of NATO expansion and purposely creating conditions to engender conflict. But Russia is not an inherent aggressor. Every time it's fought, it's because it's been provoked into fighting. The Chechen conflict of 1990s and the early 2000s were conflicts that were driven by the CIA to create forces within the Russian Federation that could lead to the fracturing of Russia. The idea was to get Chechnya to declare its independence, to separate from Russia, setting in motion a precedent. Because in 1993, 1994, when the conflict started, keep in mind that Tataria, a large chunk of Central Russian Federation, was also saying, we want to be out of Russia. And if Chechnya had declared its independence, that would set in motion that would have Tataria declare its independence. Then Bashkiria would declare its independence. Udmurtia would declare its independence, and Russia would fall apart. And if the center of Russia fall apart like that, then the Far East would say, we're independent of Moscow. We rely on our own resources. Our resources are ours. And now you've seen the fracturing of Russia, which is what the United States wanted all along. And so this is why Russia had to fight the Chechen wars. Not because it was a war of aggression, it was a war of existential survival. The Georgian conflict of 2008 is oftentimes thrown out there as proof of Russian aggression, and yet it was Mikhail Saakashvili who invaded South Ossetia, fired on Russian peacekeepers, violently attacked the capital, and compelled a Russian military response to defeat that. And this was a conflict that was driven by the United States. People don't reflect on reality. I always encourage people to study everything about a conflict. How many Americans know that Mikhail Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, had been meeting for over 6 months with Dmitry Medvedev, who was the new president of Russia, and that they were trying to work out a solution to the problems in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, a solution that would lead to the potential reabsorption of these territories into Georgia in exchange for Georgia stopping trying to become a member of NATO. All Russia wanted was a guarantee that Georgia would stop being a member of NATO, then they would work with Georgia. Susan Rice flew to Tbilisi, Georgia, met with Saakashvili in July and said, cease and desist, stop, no more conversations, you're done. Why are you talking about peace when we've been building up this Georgian military? Why aren't you talking about using the military to reacquire this territory? And then she flew away. And then in August, Saakashvili invaded South Ossetia. Georgia was defeated, 5-day war. People call it a war of Russian aggression. No, it wasn't, not even close. Russia responded to the provocations of the Georgian government, who were urged by the United States into doing this. It's the same thing with Ukraine. It didn't come out of the blue. It's not like Russia woke up one morning and said, why not invade Ukraine? It's a process that's been building since 2007, 2008, when NATO started talking, and the actual invitation to Ukraine, 2014, the US-backed coup in Maidan, 8 years of failure to implement the Minsk Accords, the building up of a NATO-trained military designed to attack the Donbass. This precipitated the conflict. Nothing happens in a vacuum. But Putin is not the aggressor. Putin is the man who saved Russia, and he will go down in history as the man who saved Russia. Now, wouldn't it be nice that when the Putin era is finished, we could cap it off with Putin as the Russian leader that was able to create the conditions for a lasting peace with the United States and the West, similar to what Gorbachev did with Ronald Reagan? That would be wonderful. Putin certainly, I believe, would love to do that. But the United States and Europe won't allow him to do that right now. And so history will remember him as the man who saved Russia, but he's also the man who, if we don't change course, will have defeated NATO and defeated the United States in Europe. And as an American, I don't want that history written. That's not how I want to see this play out. I want to see this play out in peaceful coexistence. I want to see this play out to the advantage of both America and Russia. But if we continue down this path, understanding that the expansion of NATO did not strengthen NATO, it weakened NATO. The continuation of the conflict in Ukraine does not strengthen NATO, it weakens NATO. It doesn't strengthen the United States, it weakens the United States. All it does is make Russia stronger. And this is the trajectory we're headed on, where Russia is going to achieve the strategic defeat of NATO and by extension, the United States. And this is not a good outcome.
So you mentioned the phrase conflicting ideology. No matter what happens in Russia, do you think the United States will always find an excuse to arm itself and to fight Russia? What do you think?
Well, history shows that we are capable of deviating off that path, even for a little while. The period of Ronald Reagan needs to be examined closely. I know there's a lot of people out there who are resentful to Reagan for any number of justifiable reasons, domestic policies, the economy, even his foreign policies. But as an arms control visionary, as a man who helped transition away from treating the Soviet Union as the evil empire to, as he admitted in June 1988 when he visited Moscow, he viewed Russians as friends. We have that potential. We have that potential in us. We just need the right leadership to do that. So it's not inevitable that the United States must seek conflict with Russia. If we get the right leadership who can imprint upon the establishment, the necessity of peaceful coexistence, we can peacefully coexist. The problem is that you need strong leadership, because left to its own volition, the establishment will always push for conflict with Russia, because that's how the establishment is structured. This dates back to the warning given to us all by Dwight D. Eisenhower in his Pale Royal Address in 1961, where he said, the military-industrial commission complex, together with Congress, is combining to destroy American democracy, to take over the direction of the nation, to define who we are and what we are, to make us a nation of war, not a nation of peace. John F. Kennedy struggled with the military-industrial complex. His tenure in office was cut short. We don't know what would have happened had he been able to go on to a second term. But then the Vietnam War came, the military-industrial complex became more ingrained into American society, and in the post-Vietnam War conflict, we still needed a threat. The threat was the Soviet Union to build up our military. Even Reagan came into office. Jimmy Carter, a man who's widely applauded today for his humanitarianism, understand that Jimmy Carter actually started the rebuilding of the American military. He's the one responsible for the MX missile. He's the one responsible for the B-1 bomber. He's the one responsible for all these new weapon systems that Ronald Reagan took credit for when he became president. And so it's not a Republican or a Democrat thing. It's an American thing. We are programmed to need an enemy. We are in constant search of enemies. John Stockwell, a former CIA agent, wrote a book called In Search of Enemies. It's this very thing. We must have an enemy. Ronald Reagan finally was a president who woke up one morning and said no, because this search for enemies will lead us to nuclear calamity, and we have to stop that. We need a presidential leader able to articulate a similar vision, that we must not be seeking confrontation with Russia. We must be seeking the peaceful coexistence with Russia, because the consequences of failing to do so are nuclear conflict, which will mean the termination of all humanity. And right now, there's only two people out there who are mainstream candidates articulating such a stance. One is Donald Trump, the other is RFK Jr.
I'm laughing, but it's not funny. It's pretty frightening. When you put on the news or you read the newspaper or listen to the radio, there's so many pundits out there that are adhering to this party line of Putin's horrible, Putin's losing the war, and they talk about the war in Ukraine. Don't they realize what they're saying? I just can't believe that they don't comprehend that.
Well, in order to comprehend, you have to have a foundation of knowledge. Otherwise, you're not comprehending anything.
Right.
I will say this without fear of contradiction, that the vast majority of the pundits you see on TV who are pontificating on a given subject know nothing about the subject they're pontificating on. They're there because of their political beliefs, not because of their knowledge. They're experts of nothing. People out there today, and maybe many people who listen to your show, if you've got a Ukrainian flag on your social media, or you fly a Ukrainian flag out front of your house, I'm going to call you out right now as an ignorant hypocrite. Because by putting those flags out there, the implication is that you are sympathetic to Ukraine, that you support Ukraine. You're on the side of Ukraine. You're a friend of Ukraine. Would a friend allow what's happening right now to Ukraine? Would you, if you're a friend of somebody, would you allow them to stack up firewood around their house, pour gasoline on that firewood, and start throwing burning matches at their home? You'd say, stop, this is crazy, this is insane. You're going to burn down your house. It would be even more insane if their family was inside the building. You're going to kill your family. No friend would allow that to happen, but we're standing by letting the United States destroy Ukraine because we're the ones behind this war. We started this war, and we're the ones continuing this war. Continue to pour fuel on the wood that we have stacked around the body of Ukraine. No friend would sit back in silence like 345,000 Ukrainian soldiers were sacrificed on the field of battle. No friend would stand by in silence as 10 to 20 million Ukrainians were uprooted from their homes, forced to live as refugees abroad or at home. Where no friend would allow $1 trillion worth of damage to be done to Ukrainian infrastructure. No friend would stand by and allow Ukraine to be ripped apart. This is the inevitability of Ukraine, and all the people that are sitting there with their flags on their social media for the House, they're allowing this to happen. They are not friends of Ukraine. They are enemies of Ukraine. They don't like Ukraine. They hate Ukraine. And I say that because their actions prove my point. You don't know anything about Ukraine. If you're out there articulating in favor of Ukraine and you can't tell me about the history of the Banderist movement, you can't tell me about the role played by the CIA in empowering the Banderists to create a sense of Ukrainian nationalism that was then given root in the political mainstream by the United States in 2014. If you can't explain all that, that means you're ignorant about Ukraine. If you can't articulate the difference between an ethnic Russian Eastern Ukraine and the Catholic Western Ukraine, you're ignorant. And unfortunately, the vast majority of Americans are ignorant about Ukraine. They put the flag up to feel good about themselves. But what they're really doing is perpetuating a system that is leading to the slaughter of Ukrainian people and the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And all those people pontificating on TV about the military, about the politics, about the economy, they know nothing, or They are deliberately misleading you, which is the case of many of these military officers. Remember, their job when they appear on, I broke the code a long time ago on this, Cynthia. Okay, these aren't people that appear on TV to educate us. These are people sitting at home saying, how can I make money? And CNN or MSNBC calls them up and says, I will pay you X amount of money per hit, meaning every time you go on the program, every time you go on air, you get a paycheck. And so now these people understand the following. If you went on air and said what you really believed, you'd get one paycheck. Because you'd go on, say it, and then CNN would go, oh, that's not the party line. That's not what we want to hear. That's uncomfortable. And we're never going to invite you back. One paycheck, you get it. Well, these guys aren't in the business of getting one paycheck. They want lots of paychecks. They want multiple hits. So they come on and they say, what do you want to hear? We want to hear this. I'll spin it for you. They are knowingly lying to the American people. I can guarantee you that, because there's no way that Ben Hodges or Spider Marks or General I can't remember his name, Petraeus and all these other guys that are out there talking, they know the truth. They didn't get to have stars on their shoulders by being the dumbest people on the planet. They are deliberately lying, as they lied to the American Congress. Remember, Petraeus is accustomed to lying. He has sat before the United States Congress and told bald-faced lies about the situation in Afghanistan. So it's not a problem for him now to sit before the American people and lie about the situation in Ukraine, because his job isn't to speak truth to power. His job isn't to inform and educate. His job is to spin a story that benefits the establishment, and he will get compensated for that. The moment they break script, they no longer get those paychecks. And that's the reality of all these talking heads you see on TV.
So,
and I can guarantee your audience that I'm not getting paid a dime to be on your show. So,
right. Right. So your peace initiative with your book and your movie, how are you doing?
We're okay. I mean, it's, first of all, we live in interesting times. And so, it's imperative that if you're going to educate people, you educate people based upon the currency of information. You don't want to be talking today about information that's 6 months old. So it's a full-time job to stay up to speed on what's going on, especially in the, with the Vilnius summit and the counteroffensive and the other things that are taking place. But even despite that, we are moving forward. We're in the process of making a trailer for the documentary film. And then we will use that trailer together with other fundraising incentives to include, I believe that you're organizing a fundraiser in August to raise money to finish a full-length, feature-length documentary film titled Waging Peace. And the goal is to have this film come out in time to serve as a facilitator of a large pro-disarmament demonstration that can take place in June of 2024, designed to put pressure on politicians to embrace nuclear disarmament and arms control as the centerpiece of America's foreign policy going forward. Because unless we do that, we're in grave danger of heading down a path, the termination of which can only end in nuclear conflict. That means the death of everybody. So this is a serious project. Unfortunately, documentary films require serious money, and we're in the process of trying to raise that. We have enough now to make this trailer and to begin the process of collecting materials and organizing materials. But at some point in time, we've to get the editors, we've got to get the screenwriters, the script writers, we've got to get and everybody's like, well, Scott, you're a writer. Why don't you write it? I write books. Movies, I've learned, are completely different beasts. I will, of course, play an important role in ensuring that whatever message is out there is my message, is the message I'm trying to get. But there are people who know how to write scripts for movies. You have to be, you don't have all the time in the world. See, I write books that end up being, rather thick because I haven't learned the lesson of saying less, I say more. but movies is in the business of saying less. So how do I say all this?
Hold your book up.
Well, this is an old one. This is Scorpion.
Okay.
But but how do you say all that in the form of a movie? You need people who can take a message and then capture it and distill it in the fewest words possible. And there's a talent for that, and we want to make sure that we have the right talent for the job. There's people that edit for a living who know how to get the best message out of the smallest amount of video, to pick the right video. Music is an important part of a film because music sets the mood, and we have somebody who has agreed to help us with the music, who's a professional, who has done this. He's won an Oscar for this kind of stuff. So, I'd like to say that we have some Oscar-winning talent. We might attract additional Oscar-winning talent to this film. But again, people are very kind with offering us their time and their services. But at the end of the day, to make a film, you need professionals, and professionals need to be paid. And to pay them, we have to have a budget. And to have a budget, we have to do fundraising. So that's what we're heading down the path.
So I plan on doing a show with you just about your movie. So we've talked a lot in the past, I guess, 45 minutes. What's your final thought?
My final thought is that we live in very dangerous times, made even more dangerous. I mean, I was struck by Joe Biden making a couple bald-faced statements, but most dangerous of which is that Putin will never use nuclear weapons. Bluff. And if that's truly Joe Biden's stance, that means that he is liberating himself to carry out even more provocations in Ukraine, because he's saying that even though Putin and the Russian government have said that there are red lines that cannot be crossed, and that Russia, if these lines are crossed, Russia will use all means at their disposal, and all means includes nuclear weapons. It means that that Biden's not taking this seriously. And here's the danger: as Russia moves forward towards a strategic victory in Ukraine, the United States and NATO, unable to accept having been defeated, will seek ways to change the outcome. And they may become more and more desperate. And this desperation may lead them to consider things that cross Russian red lines. And as long as the president of the United States is convincing people that Putin would never use nuclear weapons, we may find ourselves in a situation where Putin will use nuclear weapons. And then it's all over. It's too late. So this is a very dangerous situation. This is why I implore people to see past the politicized rhetoric that is taking place here in the United States, especially about Vladimir Putin, especially about Russia. The Russophobia that infects the minds of most Americans needs a vaccine of truth, a vaccine of perspective. And I would just say that you don't have to believe what I say, but at least go out and make the effort to empower yourself with knowledge and information, to learn more about Putin, who he is, what he is, where he came from, what he's achieved, what he is, what he isn't, what Russia is, what Russia isn't. Listen to the words of Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. Listen to other Russian officials. Read the speeches of Vladimir Putin. And again, start by reading his early speeches and reflect on where we are today, and understand that when Putin speaks, it's honest. It's an honest expression of Russian belief, of Russian power. And if you do this, it's not that you've become a Russian shill. It's you become somebody who's empowered with knowledge, and therefore you can challenge the assertions made by American politicians that are not founded in fact. That's the job of a citizen. It's not our job to be a shill for Putin. It is our job to hold to account those whom we elect for what they say and do that reflects on us. And when you have policymakers saying things about Russia and about the Russian leader that are divorced from reality, not linked to any factual information whatsoever, you're not shilling for Putin. You're serving America. You're doing what every American should do. Because at the end of the day, it's not about Vladimir Putin or Russia. It's about us. It's about our country. It's about who we are, who we live with, where we live, and what we want. And none of our dreams, none of our aspirations will come forth if there is a nuclear conflict. We'll all be dead. And we're right now heading down the path of imminent nuclear war with Russia.
And on that happy note, You've been listening to Scott Ritter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks, Scott. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks for having me.